Now, just as in the Tractatus, there is no sense in any deeper philosophical analysis of the truth of the knowledge involved here. Wittgenstein is saying there's no sense in any deeper analysis. All such analysis involves ripping words into a non-practical context. Let's pause to understand what this means. Remember Moore saying against the skeptic, I know this is my hand. And Wittgenstein says, standing in the background, saying, that's nonsense. Why is it nonsense? Because Moore has taken a set of words that make perfect sense in everyday life, but he's moved them into this weird activity called philosophy. Philosophy rips terms and words out of everyday life and then asks what they mean. That is the mistake of philosophy. The proper task of philosophy for Wittgenstein is, as he said, and I quote, to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle. That is, the proper task of philosophy is to show how whatever seems like a deep problem of philosophy is actually the result of a misuse of language. From Wittgenstein's point of view, what philosophers have done is mishandled words and sentences and created odd grammatical forms, asked questions that nobody else would ask. But when you do that, you rip the words and sentences out of the everyday practical context, which gives them their meaning in their everyday real language games. It's the language games that fixes the meanings of terms and of sentences. You try to pull the words out of their language games and then ask, well, what do they mean? Well, it's not surprising that you can't figure out what they mean because you've removed them from the context that gave them meaning in the first place. Thus, it's still the case that, as he said, as Wittgenstein claimed, philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. And, as he also said, if I can make one more quick quote here, the results of philosophy are the uncovering of one or another piece of plain nonsense and of the bumps that the understanding has got by running its head up against the limits of language, unquote. Now, to pause for a second here, what this means in effect is philosophy creates problems where there aren't any. Wittgenstein is not implying that there are no problems in the world. Wittgenstein is not saying there's not aesthetic and religious and moral and other problems about what to do and how to live. On the contrary, from the days of his early work, the Tractatus, he said those are the most important problems. But philosophy can't solve them. And philosophy in and of itself is nonsensical. Now here he has to distinguish between the philosophy that is nonsense and then his philosophical therapy which tries to cure the nonsense, okay? And if one wants to say, well, this seems a bit unfair, he's still doing philosophy, how can he say philosophy is nonsense? Well, it's just like the metaphor that he used in the Tractatus. He said, my statements in the Tractatus, if you understand them properly, you use them to climb the ladder, but once you've climbed to the place you want to be, you kick the ladder away. So the use of philosophy as therapy is, his kind of philosophy is supposed to show how other philosophers have misused language and so get rid of, not solve philosophical problems, but dissolve them. Thus he can say, and I quote, philosophy may in no way interfere with the actual use of language. In the end, it can only describe it, for it cannot give it any foundation either. It leaves everything as it is, unquote. That is, that's what it ought to do. So the conclusion of the Tractatus still holds good. This is the remarkable thing about Wittgenstein. He's changed the guts, the inner workings of his view of how language operates very dramatically from his early work. But in terms of what this means about philosophy, he ends up in the same place. The proper role of philosophy now is merely therapeutic, serving to reveal philosophical statements as linguistic errors. Now, Wittgenstein's impact was enormous. He's probably the most influential philosopher of the 20th century. The narrow impact was the turn of analytic philosophers away from the search for an ideal logical language and toward the investigation of ordinary language philosophy. So that's the sort of immediate impact. The more technical impact was to transform the way that Anglo-American philosophers thought about language and the kind of language theory they should be seeking, driving us now through a natural everyday language. But the wider impact was a new non-scientific skepticism about philosophical problems as rooted in a mishandling of language, and a desire to dissolve rather than resolve them through philosophical therapy. The radical implications were not lost on other philosophers either. Just as in the late Heidegger, it seemed philosophy as traditionally understood was at an end. In a later essay, 1966 essay called The End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking, Heidegger makes the remarkable claim that cybernetics, or information technology, he would say today, the telecommunications revolution, is the final fulfillment of philosophy. Why? Because it is an example of the will to power, understanding reality as pure information. Information is, after all, something immediately accessible to the mind. To try to understand being as if it were information is like trying to say, in Plato's sense, that the true reality is an idea. All of this is wrong, of course, from Heidegger's point of view. At any rate, Heidegger claims that philosophy has now been completed by science and technology. He's literally claiming contemporary science and technology have finished doing the thing that Plato started doing 2,400 years ago, this thing called philosophy. Information technology completes the Western search for power over being, substitutes the idea or concept for being itself, and reifies being as an entity. What Heidegger wishes for instead is a kind of thinking that will remain when such philosophy ends, a thinking that thinks, as in his language he would put it, the opening of aletheia, the unconcealment, which is the source of both being and thinking. The task is to think that. That is, the task is to try to think that source of unconcealment that being accomplishes, which is the source of everything we know. This thinking is, he uses another Greek term, ecstatic. The Greek term, the term ecstasy, which we get from the Greek, originally comes from the roots ek and stasis, which simply means being outside the self. So the whole method of thinking, by imposing concepts of the self on being, that's what the history of philosophy tried to do, is now being rejected here in favor of something more like ontological poetry. In effect, a way of writing that's no longer propositional. It doesn't look like normal inquiry in logical form with logical propositions, but is an attempt to write and think the moment of revelation of being by itself. Now, in looking at all this, some have interpreted Heidegger's late work as a religious and mystical phase in Heidegger's thought, or as a kind of quietism, a retreat from action and from public matters. And some have gone further to say that that results from the debacle of his political association with the Nazi regime. Now, whatever the motivation or inner meaning, Heidegger is certainly calling for an end to what we have called in this course philosophy as a mistaken genre, and for its replacement by a kind of open-ended poetic sensitivity to being. If we ask for a more precise formulation than that, If we say, Heidegger, what exactly do you mean? He's going to respond, you are trying to impose on my answer precisely the kind of framework that I've been criticizing all along. Nevertheless, Heidegger continued to think that in late or postmodern society, by that here I simply mean society in the second half of the 20th century, epitomized in the developed world, and especially by the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, that this new world, the US and the Soviet Union, embodied the technological domination of being, covering over the roots of another path toward listening to being, which he thought had been an undercurrent from ancient Greek to modern German thought. And Heidegger hoped for a return to that undercurrent. Now, in conclusion, we might ask, well, who's more radical, Heidegger or Wittgenstein? And I don't propose to answer this because it can be answered in very different ways. Heidegger's attack on the whole history of Western thought is an attack on the way we try to think about the ultimate question of the meaning of being. And he concludes that all of philosophy has really just been covering up that meaning and preventing us from experiencing it. In the future, after Heidegger's death, not many people took up Heidegger's late philosophy, with the exception of people like Jacques Derrida, about whom more later, and certain post-structuralist, postmodern philosophers. And they indeed took it very radically. Wittgenstein, in one sense, his view is more humble, but in another sense might be more radical. Because from Wittgenstein's point of view, there really is nothing for philosophy to do at all. If you show the fly the way out of the fly bottle, that's the end of it. If he can show how when someone asks a philosophical question, they've actually made a mistake in the use of words and language, then philosophy gets sort of muffled whenever it pops up. So if you want to say that Heidegger is a kind of, in this point, a kind of high priest preaching the need to go beyond the Western philosophical tradition into a poetic thinking of being and give up the propositional inquiries of philosophy, Wittgenstein is more like a mechanic who's going around and showing when anybody says, wait, I need a philosopher, that some mistake is made and that by just working on their language a little bit, their problem's solved and you can leave the philosopher at home. You don't need to call the philosopher. Which is more radical? I don't know. Each is radical enough.